I never thought a rubber mat would be the thing that turned my peaceful suburban life into absolute chaos. But here I am, standing at my living room window, watching two luxury SUVs sliding across my street like figure skaters who'd had way too much to drink. It all started 3 weeks ago when I installed heated driveway mats at my house in Maple Ridge, a planned community just outside Portland, Oregon. The forecast predicted one of the harshest winters we'd seen in years, and after spending last January breaking my back shoveling snow and chipping ice at 5 in the morning before work, I decided to invest in a solution. The mats were expensive, around $2,000 for the whole driveway, but they seemed worth every penny. You just rolled them out, plugged them in, and the embedded heating elements kept your driveway clear of ice and snow. Simple, efficient, and most importantly, they'd save me from throwing my back out again. My name is Jake Yardley, and I'm a software engineer who works from home most days. I'm 34, single, and generally keep to myself. I bought my house in Maple Ridge 2 years ago, attracted by the well-maintained streets, good schools in the area for when I eventually settled down, and the reasonable HOA fees. At the time, the homeowner association seemed like a minor inconvenience, just some basic rules about keeping your lawn mowed and not painting your house neon pink. I should have read the fine print more carefully. The morning after I installed my heat mats, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee, feeling pretty proud of myself. The mats were already plugged in and warming up, ready for the snow that was supposed to hit us that weekend. That's when I heard the doorbell ring with an aggressive urgency that immediately put me on edge. I opened the door to find a woman in her late 40s standing on my porch, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. She had that distinctive haircut. You know the one, where it's short in the back and longer in the front, with blonde highlights that looked like they'd been applied with a paint roller. She wore a puffy vest over a turtleneck despite the mild weather we were still having, and her expression suggested she'd just discovered I was running a methamphetamine lab in my garage. "Are you Jake Yardley?" she demanded, not even offering a greeting. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Karren Brennan, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowner Association. I need to speak with you about an unauthorized modification to your property." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what modification?" She gestured dramatically toward my driveway. "Those black mats covering your entire driveway. They're a clear violation of the HOA covenant, which states that all driveways must maintain their original appearance unless modifications are approved by the Architectural Review Committee." "They're heated mats," I explained, trying to keep my voice friendly. "For the winter, they prevent ice buildup." "I don't care if they dispense gold coins and cure cancer," Karren snapped. "They weren't approved. You need to remove them immediately or you'll be fined." "How much is the fine?" $50 per day until they're removed." I felt my jaw clench. "That's ridiculous. They're temporary. I'll roll them up in the spring." "The rules don't distinguish between temporary and permanent modifications, Mr. Yardley. Everything must be approved." "You should have submitted a request to the Architectural Review Committee at least 30 days before installation." "I didn't know I needed approval for a mat. It's not a permanent structure. I'm not building a deck or adding a room." Karren's eyes narrowed. "The covenant is very clear. All external modifications require approval. I suggest you read your homeowner documents more carefully. You have until Friday to remove them, or the fines begin." She turned on her heel and marched back to her white BMW, which she'd parked directly in front of my house, blocking my mailbox. I stood there for a moment, watching her drive away, feeling a mixture of disbelief and anger. I'd spent $2,000 on those mats, and now some power-hungry HOA president was telling me I couldn't use them because I hadn't asked permission first. It seemed insane. I went back inside and dug out my homeowner documents, which I'll admit I'd only skimmed when I bought the house. Sure enough, buried in page 47 of the covenant was a clause about modifications. It was written in the kind of dense legal language that made my eyes glaze over, but the gist was that Karren was technically right. Any alteration to the exterior of your property, temporary or not, required approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I decided to play by the rules. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just wanted to keep my driveway ice-free. I went online and found the HOA's website, which looked like it had been designed in 1997 and never updated. After some clicking around, I found a PDF form for the Architectural Review Committee. I filled it out, explaining that the mats were temporary, safe, and would actually improve winter safety for mail carriers and visitors to my home. I even attached photos and specifications from the manufacturer showing they were designed specifically for residential use and met all electrical safety codes. I submitted the form on Tuesday. The website said the committee met once a month and would respond within 2 weeks of their next meeting. The next meeting wasn't scheduled until the end of December, which meant I wouldn't hear back until mid-January at the earliest. Meanwhile, the weather forecast still showed snow coming that weekend, and Karren had given me until Friday to remove the mats. I called the HOA office Wednesday morning. A tired-sounding woman named Patricia answered. "Hi, I'm calling about an architectural review request I submitted yesterday. I'm wondering if there's any way to expedite it given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Patricia asked, sounding like she'd rather be anywhere else. "The HOA president told me I had to remove my driveway heat mats by Friday, but the approval process takes 6 weeks. I installed them for safety reasons with the winter weather coming. If you installed something that requires approval without getting approval first, you need to remove it. Once your request is approved, you can reinstall. But that defeats the entire purpose. We're about to get hit with a major winter storm." "I'm sorry, sir, but those are the rules. The committee can't meet outside their scheduled dates. Too many members have conflicts." I hung up feeling frustrated. The whole situation felt like bureaucratic nonsense, but I also didn't want to rack up $50 daily fines. That would add up quickly. I spent Wednesday afternoon researching my options. I found a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, but his consultation fee alone was $300, and he warned me that fighting an HOA covenant was expensive and rarely successful unless you could prove discrimination, or that the rule was being applied selectively. That gave me an idea. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood and document other modifications that might not have been approved. If I could show that the HOA was singling me out, maybe I'd have a case. What I found was enlightening. Mrs. Patterson, 3 houses down, had installed a ring light doorbell, which technically modified the appearance of her front door. The Hendersons on Oakmont Court had put up an elaborate Halloween display in October that was definitely not in keeping with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards mentioned in the covenant. The Johnsons had repainted their shutters from cream to white without approval, as far as I could tell from the before and after photos on their Facebook page from last spring. I took photos of everything and compiled them into a document. Thursday morning, I sent an email to Karen Brennan with the subject line, "Concerns about selective enforcement." In it, I politely pointed out the various modifications I'd observed and requested that the Architectural Review Committee either enforce the rules consistently or grant me a temporary waiver while my application was under review. Karren's response came 30 minutes later. Those situations are different and have been addressed internally. Your mats must be removed by 5 p.m. tomorrow. This is your final warning. I was pretty sure she was lying about the other situations being addressed, but I had no way to prove it. I spent Thursday evening weighing my options. Part of me wanted to just roll up the mats and avoid the hassle. But another part of me, the stubborn part that my ex-girlfriend always said would get me in trouble, refused to back down from what felt like a petty abuse of power. Friday morning, I didn't remove the mats. I went about my workday, taking calls and writing code, trying not to think about the showdown I knew was coming. Around 3 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang again. This time it was Karren with a man I didn't recognize, someone in his 50s wearing an expensive suit and a Rolex. "Mr. Yardley, this is Richard Stanton, our HOA attorney," Karren announced triumphantly. "I wanted him to personally inform you of the legal consequences of your continued violation." Richard looked uncomfortable with Karren's dramatic introduction. "Mr. Yardley, I'm here to explain that the HOA has the legal right to enforce its covenants. If you don't remove the mats by 5 p.m. today, you'll be fined $50 per day, and if the violation continues for more than 30 days, the HOA can place a lien on your property." "For a rubber mat," I said flatly. "For a violation of the covenant you agreed to when you purchased your home," Richard corrected, though his tone was more reasonable than Karren's. "Look, I understand this seems excessive, but HOAs have to enforce their rules consistently, or they lose the ability to enforce any rules. If we let you have unauthorized mats, then someone else will want an unauthorized shed, and then someone else will want to paint their house purple. It's a slippery slope." "Except she's not enforcing the rules consistently," I said. "I documented over a dozen violations in this neighborhood that haven't been addressed." Karren's face flushed. "Those are minor issues that we're handling through our standard process. Ring doorbells and repainted shutters are minor, but a temporary safety mat is a major violation." "How does that make sense?" "The size and visibility of your mats make them different," Karren insisted. "They're an eyesore that affects the entire neighborhood's property values. They're black mats on a black driveway. You can barely tell they're there unless you're looking for them." Richard held up his hands. "I'm not here to argue the merits. I'm here to inform you of the consequences. It's your choice, Mr. Yardley." After they left, I called my brother Derek, who lived in Seattle. Derek was a real estate agent and had dealt with plenty of HOA issues over the years. "Don't pay the fine," he advised, "but don't ignore it either. Document everything. Save all your emails, take photos, keep records of the weather and any safety incidents. If they sue you, you'll want that documentation. And honestly, Jake, HOAs usually don't sue over small stuff like this. They just threaten to. It's a power play. What if they actually do put a lien on my house? That's a nuclear option that costs them money too. Most HOAs don't want to go that far unless it's something really egregious, but cover your bases. Send them a certified letter explaining your position and requesting a hearing before the full board, not just Karren. Make them follow their own procedures." I took Derek's advice. I drafted a formal letter requesting a hearing and explaining that I believed the HOA was violating its own duty to enforce rules consistently. I sent it certified mail Friday evening, which meant Karren would get it Monday. Saturday morning, the snow started. Not a light dusting, but a legitimate winter storm that dumped 6 inches in the first 4 hours. My heat mats worked perfectly. While my neighbors were outside at dawn with shovels and ice scrapers, my driveway was completely clear, just warm pavement with steam rising off it. It was beautiful, and it justified every penny I'd spent. By noon, the entire neighborhood looked like a Christmas card, all white and pristine. It was also a mess for anyone trying to drive. I watched through my window as cars slipped and slid down our street, which has a slight incline. The city plows wouldn't hit our neighborhood until the main roads were clear, which usually took a full day after a storm like this. Around 2 p.m., I decided to walk down to the corner store for some groceries. I had my heat mats, but I still needed to be careful on the sidewalks, which were slippery and hadn't been cleared yet. As I walked, I noticed that several of my neighbors were really struggling. Old Mr. Chen from 2 houses down was chipping away at the ice on his driveway with a metal shovel, making painfully slow progress. I felt a pang of guilt. If I'd known he was having such a hard time, I would have offered to help before I left. When I got back home, I found a bright orange violation notice stuck to my front door. It was from the HOA, documenting my continued violation and informing me that daily fines would begin immediately. The notice was dated that day, Saturday, which meant Karren had driven through the snow just to put it on my door. The dedication to petness was almost impressive. Sunday morning, I woke up to find an email from the HOA's management company. The board had scheduled a special hearing for Wednesday evening to address my ongoing violations and refusal to comply with HOA directives. The email was professionally worded but had Karren's fingerprints all over it. She was clearly escalating. I spent Sunday preparing for the hearing. I printed out all my documentation, photos of other violations in the neighborhood, copies of my emails and letters, the specifications for my heat mats showing they met safety codes, and weather reports showing the storm conditions. I even drafted a short speech explaining my position. Monday morning, I got a call from Patricia at the HOA office. "Mr. Yardley, I'm calling to let you know that the hearing Wednesday will be conducted by the full board. There are 5 members total. You'll have 15 minutes to present your case, and then the board will deliberate and issue a decision. Will the meeting be open to other residents?" "Yes, board meetings are always open to residents, though they rarely attend. And if the board rules against me, then you'll be required to comply with their decision or face continued fines and potential legal action." "What's the appeals process?" There was a pause. "You can request arbitration through a third party, but you'd have to pay for half the arbitration costs, which typically run several $1,000s. "Of course I would," I muttered. Monday and Tuesday were quiet, just more snow and more evidence of how effective my heat mats were. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, which meant all the snow that had been shoveled or partially melted was now ice. Our street became a skating rink. I watched from my window as people inched their cars down the hill, pumping their brakes and white-knuckling their steering wheels. Tuesday evening, something interesting happened. I was making dinner when I heard a crash outside. I ran to the window and saw that a car had slid into a parked vehicle about 4 houses down. Nobody appeared to be hurt, but the 2 drivers got out and started inspecting the damage, both looking frustrated and cold. I grabbed my jacket and went out to see if I could help. The driver who'd done the sliding was a younger guy, maybe late 20s, who I'd seen around but never spoken to. "I wasn't even going fast," he said, running his hand through his hair. "I just tapped the brakes and the car just kept going." "Ice is brutal this year," the other driver said. She was older, maybe in her 60s, and seemed more resigned than angry. "I'm just glad you weren't going any faster. Do you guys need anything? Want to come inside and warm up while you exchange insurance?" I offered. They both declined, said they'd be fine but thanked me for checking. As I walked back to my house, I noticed Karren's BMW parked in her driveway 3 houses up. Her driveway, like everyone else's, was a sheet of ice. She'd attempted to shovel, but you could see where she'd given up halfway, leaving dangerous patches of clear ice mixed with packed snow. Wednesday arrived, and with it, the board hearing. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was mainly used for HOA meetings and the occasional kid's birthday party. I got there 15 minutes early and was surprised to find the parking lot already half full. Apparently word had gotten out about the hearing, and people were curious. Inside, the clubhouse was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs for residents. About 20 people were already seated, which was a lot for a Wednesday evening in the middle of winter. I recognized most of them from around the neighborhood, though I didn't know many by name. The board members filed in at 7 sharp. Karren sat in the middle, flanked by 2 men and 2 women I vaguely recognized. One of the men was Brad Thompson, who I knew worked in commercial real estate. One of the women was Susan Holloway, a retired teacher who always seemed friendly when I saw her at the grocery store. The others I didn't know. Karren called the meeting to order and went through some preliminary business, approving the minutes from the last meeting and discussing the snow removal contract for common areas. Then she got to what everyone was really there for. The next item on our agenda is a hearing regarding ongoing violations by Mr. Jake Yardley of 847 Riverside Drive. Mr. Yardley has installed unauthorized heating mats on his driveway in violation of Article 7, Section 3 of our covenant. Despite multiple warnings, he has refused to remove them. Mr. Yardley, you have 15 minutes to address the board. I stood up and walked to the front, my folder of documentation in hand. I'd been nervous driving over, but now that I was here, I felt a strange calm. I laid out my case methodically. The safety benefits of the mats, the fact that they were temporary and removable, the other violations I'd documented that hadn't been enforced, and my argument that the rule as applied was both unreasonable and inconsistently enforced. I'm not trying to cause problems, I concluded. I'm trying to keep my driveway safe during one of the worst winters we've had in years. I followed up with a formal application for approval, which I understand takes time, but I was told to remove the mats immediately, even though they pose no danger and actually improve safety. Meanwhile, there are over a dozen other modifications in this neighborhood that also weren't approved, and none of those homeowners are being fined or threatened with liens. When I finished, Karren immediately jumped in. The situations you've documented are completely different. Small modifications like doorbell cameras are specifically exempted under our reasonable use guidelines. Your mats cover your entire driveway and are clearly visible from the street. Actually, they're barely visible, I countered. They're black on black. And I don't see anything in the covenant about size thresholds for what requires approval. Brad Thompson, the real estate guy, spoke up. I have a question. How much did these mats cost? About $2,000. And they're completely removable, no installation required, correct? They plug into a standard outdoor outlet. I can roll them up and store them in my garage whenever I want. Brad nodded slowly, glancing at the other board members. Susan Holloway raised her hand. I'd like to say something, Susan said. I've been on this board for 6 years, and I've seen a lot of these disputes. Usually they're about things that genuinely affect the neighborhood's appearance or property values. Someone wants to paint their house an unusual color or build a fence that blocks views, things like that. I'm having trouble understanding how temporary rubber mats that improve safety are in the same category. Karren's expression tightened. The covenant doesn't require us to make value judgments about whether a modification is worthwhile. It requires residents to get approval before making changes. That's the rule. But we have discretion in how we enforce rules, Susan countered, and we have a responsibility to be reasonable. If Mr. Yardley's mats aren't hurting anything and actually make his property safer, why are we fighting him on this? Because if we don't enforce our rules, we lose all credibility, Karren snapped. Next month someone will want to install a fountain or park an RV in their driveway, and they'll point to this case as precedent for doing whatever they want without approval. I think that's a bit of a stretch, Brad said carefully. This seems like a pretty specific situation. The board debated for another 20 minutes. I sat in the audience, watching the other residents watch the board. Some people seemed sympathetic to my position. Others looked bored and kept checking their phones. A few seemed to be on Karren's side, nodding when she made points about rules and order. Finally, Karren called for a vote on whether my mats violated the covenant. It was 4-1 in favor, with only Susan voting that they didn't constitute a violation. Then they voted on whether to require me to remove them. That vote was 3-2, with Susan and Brad voting against removal. The board has decided that you must remove your heating mats within 7 days, Karren announced with barely concealed satisfaction. Fines will continue to accrue until they're removed. Do you have any questions? Just one, I said, standing up. When will my formal application be reviewed by the architectural committee? Karren consulted a paper in front of her. The committee meets December 20th. They'll review your application then, and you'll receive a decision within 2 weeks of that meeting. So I should remove my mats now in the middle of winter, and then possibly be approved to reinstall them in January. That's correct. That's insane, someone said from the audience. I turned and saw it was the younger guy whose car had slid on Tuesday. His driveway is the only one on the block that's actually safe right now. My car just slid into someone because of the ice. This hearing is for board business only, Karren said sharply. If you have comments, you can submit them in writing. I think what he's saying is relevant, Brad interjected. If these mats are genuinely improving safety and we force him to remove them and someone gets hurt on his property because of ice, doesn't that expose the HOA to liability? The attorney, Richard Stanton, who'd been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. May I address that question? Karren nodded reluctantly. From a legal perspective, the HOA is not responsible for individual property safety. However, Mr. Thompson raises an interesting point. If the board is aware of a safety enhancement and orders it removed, and someone is subsequently injured, that could potentially be argued as negligent in a personal injury lawsuit. Karren looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. That's a hypothetical situation. It's a valid concern, Richard said mildly. The board huddled and whispered among themselves for a few minutes. Finally, Karren spoke again. The board's decision stands. Mr. Yardley has 7 days to remove the mats. However, we'll expedite his architectural review application and try to have a decision before the end of December. Meeting adjourned. I left the clubhouse feeling defeated but not surprised. As I walked to my car, several neighbors stopped me to express support. The young guy from the accident introduced himself as Marcus Young and said he thought the whole thing was ridiculous. An older woman named Grace told me she'd had her own battles with Karren over garden decorations and knew exactly what I was going through. Don't let her win, Grace said, patting my arm. She thrives on controlling people. The more you stand up to her, the less power she has. I drove home thinking about what to do next. 7 days wasn't much time. I could remove the mats and avoid further fines, but that felt like surrender. I could leave them in place and rack up fines while fighting it through arbitration, but that would cost thousands of dollars with no guarantee of success. Or I could try a different approach entirely. Thursday morning, I called a local news station. I explained the situation to a producer, framing it as a human interest story about HOA overreach. She sounded interested and said she'd pitch it to the assignment editor. 3 hours later, a reporter named Jennifer Chavez called me back. "We'd love to cover this story," she said. "Can we send a crew out tomorrow morning?" "Absolutely." "Great. We'll do an interview with you, get some footage of your driveway and the neighborhood, and try to reach out to the HOA for comment. This is exactly the kind of local story our viewers love." Friday morning, Jennifer and her cameraman arrived around 9. She was professional and well prepared, having already reviewed the HOA covenant and my documentation. We did the interview in my driveway with my house, and the heat mats visible in the background. "So explain to our viewers what's happening here," Jennifer said, microphone in hand while the camera rolled. I told the whole story, keeping it factual and measured. I explained how the mats worked, why I'd installed them, and how the HOA had responded. I showed Jennifer the difference between my clear driveway and my neighbor's icy ones. She interviewed Marcus Young, who talked about his accident. She tried to interview Karren, but when she knocked on Karren's door, Karren refused to come out and shouted through the door that she had no comment. The story aired that evening during the 6 o'clock news. Jennifer had done a great job presenting both sides, though it was pretty clear where viewer sympathy would land. The segment showed my clean driveway, the icy street, and Marcus describing his accident. They showed the violation notice on my door and included Karren's no comment response. The anchor wrapped up by saying, "An HOA dispute that raises questions about common sense versus covenant rules. We'll continue to follow this story." The response was immediate. By 8 p.m., the station's Facebook post about the story had over 3,000 shares and hundreds of comments, almost all of them criticizing the HOA. People shared their own HOA horror stories. Several lawyers commented offering their services. The story got picked up by a local Reddit community and went semi-viral, at least by Portland standards. Saturday morning, my phone started ringing. First, it was a newspaper reporter wanting to do a follow-up story. Then it was a local radio show asking if I'd come on as a guest. Then, most surprisingly, it was Patricia from the HOA office. "Mr. Yardley, the board has requested an emergency meeting for Monday evening to reconsider your situation. Would you be available to attend? What changed?" I'm not at liberty to discuss board deliberations, but I will say that the board has received significant feedback from residents over the past 24 hours. I agreed to attend. Over the weekend, the story continued to gain traction. The newspaper ran their version on Sunday, and it got picked up by a few regional news aggregators. My neighbors kept stopping by to tell me they'd seen the story and supported me. Even people who'd voted to uphold the HOA's decision at the hearing seemed to have changed their minds after seeing the news coverage. Monday evening, I returned to the clubhouse. This time, the parking lot was packed, with cars lining the street. Inside, every chair was full, and people were standing along the walls. The energy was completely different from the previous meeting. This felt less like a board hearing and more like a town hall uprising. Karren called the meeting to order, but her usual confidence seemed shaken. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. The other board members looked uncomfortable. We've called this emergency meeting to reconsider the board's decision regarding Mr. Yardley's driveway heating mats, Karren began. In light of resident feedback and further review of the covenant language, the board has decided to grant Mr. Yardley a temporary waiver while his formal application is under review. The Architectural Review Committee will meet this Thursday for an emergency session to review his application, and we expect to have a decision by Friday. There was actually applause from the audience. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Additionally, Karren continued, her voice tight, the board is forming a subcommittee to review our covenant enforcement procedures and make recommendations for updates to ensure consistent and reasonable application of our rules. Susan Holloway spoke up. I'd like to propose that we also suspend all fines that have been assessed against Mr. Yardley pending the committee's decision. So moved, Brad Thompson said immediately. The motion passed 4-1, with only Karren voting against it. After the meeting, I was surrounded by neighbors congratulating me and sharing their own frustrations with HOA rules. It felt good to have won, but I also felt a little guilty about the public pressure campaign. Karren might have been unreasonable, but she'd also been publicly embarrassed, and I knew that wouldn't be forgotten. Thursday came, and true to their word, the Architectural Review Committee met to consider my application. This time, the review was conducted professionally and thoughtfully. They asked questions about electrical safety, whether the mats could damage the driveway surface, and how visible they were from the street. I provided detailed answers and manufacturer documentation. The whole process took about an hour. Friday afternoon, I received an email from Patricia. My application had been approved with conditions. The mats must be removed by April 1st each year. They couldn't be painted or decorated in any way, and I had to provide proof of liability insurance covering their use. All reasonable conditions that I was happy to accept. I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong. The real drama started 2 weeks later in mid-December. We got hit with another massive winter storm, worse than the first one. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit and freezing rain fell for 6 hours before turning to snow. It was the kind of weather that makes the Pacific Northwest completely shut down because we're just not equipped for it. My heat mats continued to perform perfectly. I watched from my window as the freezing rain hit my driveway and immediately melted, running off into the street. Meanwhile, every other driveway and the street itself turned into a solid sheet of ice. It was treacherous. The city advised everyone to stay home if possible, and most people did, except Karren apparently had somewhere important to be. Around noon on the worst day of the storm, I was working at my desk when I heard a commotion outside. I looked out my window and saw Karren's white BMW backing out of her driveway, or trying to. The car was sliding more than rolling, completely unable to get traction on the ice. I watched as Karren tried to correct her steering, but the car just kept sliding sideways down her sloped driveway. She was heading right for the street, picking up speed. At the same moment, another HOA board member, Brad Thompson, was driving down our street in his Mercedes SUV, going maybe 5 miles per hour but still too fast for the conditions. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Karren's BMW slid into the street right in front of Brad's Mercedes. Brad hit his brakes, which was exactly the wrong thing to do on ice. His SUV slid forward, unable to stop, and crashed directly into the side of Karren's car with a sickening crunch of metal and the tinkle of breaking glass. Both vehicles spun slightly from the impact and then just sat there in the middle of the street, steam rising from their hoods. I grabbed my phone and ran outside, dialing 911 as I went. Other neighbors were emerging from their houses too, carefully making their way across the ice. By the time I reached the accident scene, both drivers had gotten out of their vehicles. Karren was screaming at Brad, her face red with anger and probably shock. Brad was trying to remain calm, but he looked shaken. "You were driving way too fast," Karren yelled. "You hit my car." "I was going 5 miles per hour, Brad shot back. "You slid into the street right in front of me. What was I supposed to do? Watch where you're going. This is completely your fault." I reached them carefully, my boots barely maintaining grip on the ice. "Is anyone hurt?" They both said they were fine, physically at least. Karren's BMW had significant damage to the passenger side where Brad had hit it. Brad's Mercedes had front-end damage and his airbags had deployed. Neither car was going anywhere. "I've called 911, I told them. "They're sending police and asking if anyone needs an ambulance." "I don't need an ambulance," Karren snapped. "I need a police report showing that he caused this accident." "Me?" Brad looked incredulous. "You're the one who slid into the street. You didn't even look." I couldn't see because my windows were fogging up from the defrost. And I couldn't get traction because of the ice on my driveway. More neighbors had gathered now, standing at safe distances and watching the argument unfold. Marcus Young was filming on his phone. Grace, the older woman who'd supported me at the hearing, stood next to me and whispered, "This is what happens when you're too stubborn to admit someone else had a good idea." The police arrived about 20 minutes later, which was actually pretty fast given the conditions. Officer Daniels was a middle-aged guy who looked like he'd already dealt with a dozen accidents that morning. He took statements from both drivers, examined the scene, and talked to witnesses. "Here's what I'm seeing," Officer Daniels said after completing his investigation. "Miss Brennan, you lost control of your vehicle on your driveway due to ice and slid into the street. Mr. Thompson, you were unable to stop in time because of the road conditions and struck Miss Brennan's vehicle. Given the weather and visibility, I'm not citing anyone for this accident. You'll need to work it out with your insurance companies." "That's unacceptable," Karren protested. "He was clearly at fault. Madam, with all due respect, you slid into traffic. If anyone's at fault here, it's probably you, but I'm giving both of you a break because of the weather. I suggest you accept that and call your insurance." While Officer Daniels was finishing up his paperwork, another car came sliding down the street. It was Susan Holloway, another board member, also going too slow to be dangerous but too fast to stop on the ice. She pumped her brakes frantically as she approached the accident scene. "Look out!" someone yelled. Susan's car missed Karren's BMW by inches but slid sideways and crashed into Brad's already damaged Mercedes, hitting the rear quarter panel. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to push Brad's car forward a few feet and cause more damage. Susan got out of her car, looking horrified. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop. The brakes weren't working." "The brakes work fine," Officer Daniels said with the weary patience of someone who'd explained this 100 times. "Ice doesn't care about brakes. This is exactly why the city is telling people to stay home." Now we had 3 damaged vehicles in the middle of the street and 3 very unhappy HOA board members. Officer Daniels called for a second unit to help manage the scene and document Susan's accident. The whole street was blocked now, which didn't matter much since nobody else was dumb enough to be driving in these conditions. I stood there on the ice, watching this absurd scene unfold, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had fought tooth and nail to prevent me from using heat mats for safety reasons, citing concerns about aesthetics and rule following. Now 3 board members had crashed into each other in a chain reaction accident directly caused by the ice they were so determined to preserve on their own driveways. Marcus Young walked over to me, still filming. "Dude, this is incredible. Are you seeing this?" "I feel like I'm in a movie," I admitted. "You should go turn on your heat mats," Grace suggested with a mischievous grin. "Really rub it in. That seems petty." "Honey, petty is exactly what this situation calls for. I didn't do it, but I thought about it." Instead, I went back home and watched from my window as 2 tow trucks arrived to remove the damaged vehicles. The police took another hour to clear the scene, interviewing more witnesses and taking measurements. By the time they left, it was mid-afternoon and the temperature had dropped even further. That evening, I got a text from Patricia at the HOA office. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow at 7 p.m. All residents encouraged to attend." I showed up Tuesday evening, curious about what could be so urgent. The clubhouse was packed again, and the energy was different from previous meetings. People seemed amused more than anything else. The story of the board member pile-up had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and it had become something of a punchline. Karren called the meeting to order. She had a visible bruise on her arm from the accident, and she looked like she hadn't slept. Brad and Susan also looked rough, sitting at the board table with expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. "Thank you all for coming," Karren began. "I want to address yesterday's accidents directly. I know there's been some talk in the neighborhood, and I want to be clear that what happened was a result of extraordinary weather conditions, not any failure of judgment on anyone's part." Someone in the audience laughed. Karren's face flushed, but she continued. "That said, the board has decided to form a winter safety committee to review our neighborhood's preparedness for severe weather. We're also updating our architectural review guidelines to include a new category for temporary safety equipment, which will have an expedited approval process." "In other words, Jake was right," someone called out from the audience. There was general laughter and agreement. Karren powered through, clearly hating every second of this. "The board recognizes that resident safety is paramount, and we're committed to ensuring our rules reflect that priority. We're also suspending all architectural review fees for winter safety equipment applications submitted before January 1st. Brad Thompson spoke up. "I want to add something personal. I was one of the board members who voted to make Jake remove his heat mats. After yesterday, after literally crashing into someone because of ice, I realize how wrong I was. Jake was trying to prevent exactly what happened to us, and we fought him on it because we were more concerned with procedure than common sense. I apologize for that." There was a moment of surprised silence, and then people started clapping. Brad looked relieved to have said his piece. Susan raised her hand. "I'd also like to suggest that the HOA consider installing heat mats or similar equipment on commonly used pathways, particularly the sidewalk leading to the clubhouse and the area around the mailboxes. If we're serious about safety, we should put our money where our mouth is." "That's a significant expense," Karren said automatically. "So is the liability if someone gets hurt," Brad countered. "And it's cheaper than a lawsuit." The board voted to explore options for community winter safety improvements, with a budget proposal to be presented at the next regular meeting. They also voted to send a neighborhood-wide email acknowledging the importance of winter safety and encouraging residents to take appropriate precautions. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me with questions about where I'd bought my heat mats and how much they cost. I spent 20 minutes essentially hosting an impromptu product demonstration in the parking lot, showing photos on my phone and explaining how they worked. It felt surreal to go from HOA villain to neighborhood expert in the span of a few weeks. The next day, Wednesday, I got a call from Jennifer Chavez, the news reporter who done the original story. "Jake, I heard about the accidents. Is it true that 3 HOA board members crashed into each other on ice?" "It is true. It was pretty spectacular, actually. We'd love to do a follow-up story. Would you be willing to go on camera again?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to let it go. Karren and the others had already been embarrassed enough. But another part of me felt like the story deserved to be told completely, if only to highlight the absurdity of HOA overreach and the importance of common sense in community governance. "Sure," I said. "When do you want to meet?" The follow-up story aired Friday evening. Jennifer had done excellent work, interviewing Officer Daniels about the accidents, getting footage of the damaged vehicles being towed, and speaking with Marcus Young and other witnesses. She also got Brad Thompson to go on camera and discuss his change of heart about the heat mats. "I thought we were enforcing reasonable rules," Brad said in the interview. "But when you crash your car because of something you prevented someone else from fixing, it makes you realize how unreasonable you were being. Safety has to come first, rules second." The story ended with a shot of my clear driveway next to Karren's still icy one, while Jennifer's voiceover noted that the HOA had updated its policies, and several other residents were now applying for heat mat permits. It was a satisfying conclusion, vindicating my original position while showing that change was possible. The story got even more traction than the first one. This time it was picked up by national news aggregators and shared widely on social media. I started getting emails from HOA reform advocates, from manufacturers of winter safety equipment, and even from a literary agent who thought my story would make a good book. It was overwhelming and a little surreal. Karren resigned from the HOA board the following week. She sent an email to all residents announcing that she was stepping down due to personal reasons and work commitments. But everyone knew the real reason. The embarrassment of the accidents, combined with the negative attention from the news stories, had made her position untenable. Several residents had called for her resignation at the Tuesday meeting, and while the board had publicly supported her, I suspect they'd privately encouraged her to step down. Brad Thompson was elected as the new president in a special vote. His first act was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the HOA, and to present me with a full refund of the fines I'd been assessed. He also established a new protocol for architectural review that prioritized safety equipment, and reduced the review time from 6 weeks to 1 week for most applications. The winter continued to be harsh, but my heat mats kept performing perfectly. By January, 7 other households in Maple Ridge had installed their own heating systems, all properly approved through the new expedited process. The neighborhood became something of a model for how HOAs could balance aesthetic standards with practical safety concerns. I had my own adjustments to make as well. The attention from the news stories had made me more visible in the neighborhood than I'd ever intended to be. People I'd never spoken to would wave and stop me on walks to chat about HOA issues or winter safety. It was nice in some ways, feeling more connected to my community, but it was also exhausting for someone who generally preferred to keep to himself. In February, something unexpected happened. Susan Holloway knocked on my door one afternoon with a plate of cookies and a request. "Jake, the board is forming a new community safety committee and we'd like you to chair it. I know you didn't ask for any of this attention, but you've shown good judgment and willingness to stand up for what's right. We could use that kind of leadership." I was surprised by the offer. I'm not really a committee person. "Neither was I until I joined the board," Susan said with a smile. But communities work better when people get involved, especially people who aren't just looking for power or control. You proved that you care about doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. That's exactly who we need. I told her I'd think about it. Over the next few days, I did think about it, quite a lot actually. The whole experience had taught me something important about community living. You couldn't just ignore problems or assume someone else would handle them. When you saw something that needed fixing, especially when it affected people's safety, you had an obligation to speak up, even if it meant conflict. I accepted Susan's offer and became chair of the new safety committee. It was more work than I'd anticipated, but it was also rewarding. We implemented a neighborhood snow removal partnership where people with snow blowers helped elderly residents. We created a list of homes with heat mats or other winter safety equipment so people knew which driveways were safe to walk on. We even secured HOA funding for salt and sand stations at key locations in the neighborhood. The committee also worked on summer safety initiatives, including a neighborhood watch program and improved lighting along walking paths. It felt good to be contributing positively rather than just fighting against unreasonable rules. Brad Thompson turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He was practical, willing to listen, and focused on serving the community rather than controlling it. Under his leadership, the board revised dozens of outdated or overly restrictive covenant provisions. They created clearer guidelines for what required approval and what didn't. They established an ombudsman position to help residents navigate HOA procedures. The whole culture of the organization shifted from enforcement-focused to service-focused. Karren, for her part, mostly kept to herself after resigning. I'd see her occasionally at the grocery store or driving through the neighborhood, and we'd exchange awkward nods but never spoke. I didn't feel any animosity toward her. In a weird way, I felt bad for her. She'd clearly invested a lot of her identity in being HOA president and enforcing rules, and losing that position so publicly must have been humiliating. In March, as winter finally started to release its grip on Portland, I hosted a neighborhood gathering at my house. It was a casual thing, just a Saturday afternoon barbecue with an open invitation to everyone on my street. About 30 people showed up, including Brad, Susan, and several other board members. Even Marcus Young came, bringing his girlfriend and some homemade potato salad. We stood around my driveway, which still had the heat mats laid out even though we didn't need them anymore, and people shared their own HOA stories. It turned out almost everyone had a tale of bureaucratic frustration or rules that didn't make sense. The gathering became an impromptu therapy session, with people laughing and commiserating about the challenges of community living. "You know what the real lesson is here," Grace said, halfway through her second glass of wine. "HOAs aren't inherently bad. They're just organizations run by people, and people can be ridiculous. But people can also be reasonable when you hold them accountable and remind them what actually matters." "I'll drink to that," Brad said, raising his beer. We all toasted to common sense, to community, and to the hope that we'd all learned something from the winter's drama. As April arrived and I rolled up my heat mats for the season, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. I'd gone from being an anonymous software engineer who kept to himself to being a minor local celebrity and neighborhood leader. I'd fought my HOA and won, not through legal action but through public pressure and persistence. I'd seen people change their minds and admit they were wrong. I'd watched a community come together around a shared frustration and turn it into positive change. The heat mats themselves, the thing that had started this whole saga, sat rolled up in my garage, ready for next winter. They'd cost me $2,000 and weeks of stress, but they'd also taught me something valuable about standing up for what's right, even when it's easier to go along with unreasonable demands. My brother Derek called me in mid-April to check in. "So how's life in HOA hell?" "Actually, it's pretty good now," I told him. "We changed the leadership, reformed the rules, and built a better community in the process. That's way more optimistic than I expected." "Yeah, me too. Turns out you can fight City Hall, or in this case, the HOA, and actually win. Just don't let it go to your head. Next thing you know, you'll be running for HOA president yourself." I laughed at the idea, but privately I didn't completely dismiss it. Not yet, anyway. For now, I was content to chair the safety committee and help make Maple Ridge a better place to live. But I'd learned that change was possible when people were willing to speak up and stand their ground. The story made one final appearance in the news in May. Jennifer Chavez did a "Where Are They Now" segment showing how the neighborhood had changed since the original heat mat controversy. She interviewed several residents who'd installed their own safety equipment, showed the new salt and sand stations we'd set up, and talked to Brad about the HOA's reformed approach to governance. The segment ended with Jennifer standing in front of my house, my driveway clearly visible behind her. What started as a dispute over rubber mats became a lesson in community governance and the importance of prioritizing safety over bureaucracy. Thanks to one resident's willingness to fight an unreasonable rule, this entire neighborhood is now safer and more prepared for winter weather. In Portland, I'm Jennifer Chavez. My phone buzzed with texts from friends and coworkers who'd seen the segment. My inbox filled with messages from people around the country sharing their own HOA horror stories and thanking me for standing up to the bureaucracy. It was gratifying but also a little uncomfortable. I hadn't set out to be anyone's champion or to start a movement. I just wanted to keep my driveway clear. But I suppose that's how most change starts. Someone faces an unreasonable situation and decides not to accept it. They push back, they make noise, they refuse to back down. Sometimes they lose, but sometimes, if they're lucky and persistent, they win. And when they win, it doesn't just help them. It helps everyone who comes after. As summer arrived and I finally stored my heat mats away completely, I found myself looking forward to next winter. Not because I enjoyed cold weather or dealing with snow, but because I knew I'd be prepared. My driveway would be clear, my neighbors would be safer, and the HOA would be focused on serving the community rather than controlling it. The whole experience had changed me in ways I was still processing. I was more engaged with my neighborhood, more willing to speak up when something didn't make sense, and more aware of how small actions could lead to larger changes. I'd also developed an unexpected expertise in heated driveway systems and HOA governance, which made me the go-to person for anyone dealing with similar issues. In late August, I was contacted by a law firm in Seattle that specialized in HOA disputes. They wanted to use my case as an example in a presentation they were giving to other attorneys about effective advocacy strategies. I agreed and spent an afternoon on a video call walking them through the timeline of events and the tactics that had ultimately succeeded. The key thing, I told them, was documenting everything and telling the story publicly. HOAs rely on people not making waves. Once you shine a light on unreasonable behavior, it's hard for them to justify it. What advice would you give someone facing a similar situation? One of the attorneys asked. First, read your covenant and understand exactly what it says. Second, document other violations to show selective enforcement if that's happening. Third, go through the proper channels first, but don't be afraid to escalate if those channels fail. Fourth, tell your story. Local news loves this stuff and public pressure works. And finally, stay calm and factual. Don't make it personal, even when it feels personal. They thanked me for my time and said they'd send me a copy of their presentation. It felt strange to be giving advice on HOA disputes, but I supposed I'd earned the expertise through experience. September brought the first hints of fall, and with it, questions from neighbors about when they should start preparing for winter. Several people asked about heat mats, and I directed them to the manufacturer's website. A few asked if I'd be willing to help them install their own systems, and I agreed. It felt good to help others avoid the struggles I'd faced. The HOA held its annual meeting in October, and I attended along with about 50 other residents. Brad presented a comprehensive report on the changes implemented over the past year. The architectural review process had been streamlined. Response times had improved dramatically. The number of complaints and disputes had dropped by more than half. Property values in Maple Ridge had actually increased slightly, contrary to Karren's predictions about chaos and declining standards. "We learned an important lesson this year," Brad said in his closing remarks. "Rules exist to serve the community, not the other way around. When we prioritize common sense and safety over rigid enforcement, everyone benefits." I want to thank Jake Yardley for reminding us of that truth, even though it took us longer than it should have to listen. People applauded, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I appreciated the recognition, but I also wanted to move past being the heat mat guy. I wanted to just be a normal resident of a well-functioning community. As October turned to November, the weather forecasts started predicting another cold winter. I checked my heat mats, confirmed they were still in good condition, and prepared to lay them out again. This time, though, I wouldn't be alone. 10 other houses on my street had their own heating systems ready to go. The neighborhood was prepared. The first snow came in late November, just after Thanksgiving. I rolled out my mats, plugged them in, and watched them work their magic once again. My driveway stayed clear while snow accumulated everywhere else. But this time, several other driveways were also clear. The street looked different, safer, with patches of visible pavement among the snow. No violation notices appeared on my door. No angry HOA president came to lecture me about unauthorized modifications. Nobody threatened fines or liens. Instead, I got a text from Brad Thompson. "Stay safe out there. Glad we've got people like you looking out for the neighborhood." It was a simple message, but it represented how far things had come. From conflict to cooperation, from rigid enforcement to reasonable governance, from isolation to community. All because of a rubber mat and a willingness to fight for common sense. As I sit here now, looking out my window at my clear driveway and the snow-covered street beyond, I think about what this whole experience taught me. It taught me that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's difficult. It taught me that people can change their minds when presented with clear evidence and reasonable arguments. It taught me that communities work best when people get involved, rather than complaining from the sidelines. And it taught me that sometimes the smallest things, like a heated mat on a driveway, can spark the biggest changes. Winter is here again, and I'm ready for it. My driveway is clear, my neighbors are safe, and my HOA is focused on serving rather than controlling. It took a lot of work and stress to get here, but it was worth it. Because now when it snows, I don't just think about my own safety. I think about everyone on my street, about the elderly folks who don't have to risk falling on ice, about the young families who can walk safely to their cars, about the community we've built together. The heat mats hum quietly beneath the snow, doing their job, keeping the ice at bay. And I go back to my work, my life, my normal routine, knowing that sometimes ordinary people can make extraordinary differences just by refusing to accept unreasonable rules and fighting for common sense. That's the real story here, not the crashes or the news coverage or the drama with Karren. The real story is about a community that learned to prioritize people over procedures, safety over aesthetics, and common sense over blind rule following. And that's a story worth telling.